Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon. David called me about 2-3 weeks ago. Normally when I speak here, it is because it is to give historic context as to why we are who we are and why we should be doing what we should be doing. Last year I came, it was the 400th anniversary of Thanksgiving. I came dressed as a pilgrim. Today I'm dressed in colonial attire as a Minuteman. One of the things that Dave has done is he's wanted to hold the rallies on Flag Day. Flag Day was June 14th, 1777. That flag in front of you, to the side of you, behind me, was designed originally from a variation of the Sons of Liberty flag, and then later on the stars were anchored into a union or the canton in the corner. But it's also the anniversary of several other events that you should be aware of. Within this week, in 1775, there was a ship called Liberty, ironically. It was seized in Boston Harbor for doing something a few years ago would have been completely legal. But with the new administration in Great Britain wanting to come down on the colonies and on Britons themselves, they decided to make an example. The man who owned that ship was John Hancock. At that time, he went before court, pleaded his case, had an attorney, an old friend of his from birth, literally, by the name of John Adams. And Adams had won the case for him. He was exonerated from any criminal wrongdoing, and his ship was supposed to be returned. It never was. Instead, the Tory administration, with the British Navy, took that ship and they used it against colonial trade and against our seafaring ancestors to further tyrannize them. Later on, that ship would be captured and burned. Yesterday was the anniversary of another ship doing the same thing in Narragansett Bay, Rhode Island. People wonder why our ancestors during the Revolutionary War era and before and after had recourse to arms. There was another ship called the Gaspé that was built here in the colonies, hired by the British Navy and the customs officials, again, to seize the ships, to hamper trade, and to bring revenue into their Tory friends on both sides of the Atlantic. But the colonists, led by Abraham Whipple and John Brown, had enough. They said, no longer are we going to do that. They pleaded. The ship's captain was so contemptuous of the authority, the local authority, which was not of their political leanings, they ignored it. Does that sound familiar to our day now? Well, they were forced to take matters in their own hands. One of the ships in the harbor, Patriot ship, allowed them to chase them, ended up getting them stuck on a sandbar. That night, they rowed out and they burned her to the waterline, no longer to terrorize Narragansett Bay. It is also an anniversary of another great event, one you have heard of, Bunker Hill. On Friday, the 17th of June, it is Bunker Hill Day. You see what I have here. This is called a long pattern musket. It was issued to the British Army through most of the 18th century, also known as the Brown Bess. It was also the weapon of choice and weapons stored in the houses throughout colonial America. Why did they do this? Well, the first reason they did it is they had to protect themselves. The second reason is they needed to eat. It was a natural part of what they did. Revisionist history tries to tell us otherwise because they have something they want to do to us, and we're not going to allow them to continue. But the only way we're going to know how to fight them is to know what the true story is. And if you don't know where you came from, you'll never know where you are going. Many of our fellow patriots today are trying to work hard, but even many of them don't fully understand the story as to what happened. I want to talk about Bunker Hill for a moment, because it was the culmination of the creation of an army. For years, the colonies had to defend themselves. Many years after that, they helped the British Empire increase its size by fighting in their ranks, living in the ships and in their arms abroad with provincial and militia companies. It was a system used in England herself and in the British Isles. At the very beginning of the Revolutionary War, Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Massachusetts militias had gathered, and they had beaten the British, who had dared to venture out to seize the powder and the weaponry in Concord. How ironic, trying to seize arms. By the summer of 1775, the British Army could not venture outside of Boston. It was physically impossible. The Patriots were too strong. But what they wanted to do was solidify their position in Boston. One of the places they decided to fortify were the Charlestown Heights, known as the Bunker Hill section, still known as the Bunker Hill section today. That's Bunker's Hill, Breed's Hill, and Morton's Hill. They had built a redoubt. And in that redoubt, largely garrisoned by Massachusetts men, but protected on the front and the flanks by New Hampshire and Connecticut men, who had come to help defend liberty that was threatening them from losing it as well. In that redoubt was a man by the name of William Prescott. He was the colonel of the forces, veteran of the different colonial wars that the English had fought against the French and the Spanish. And they had a problem. One of the big problems they had was the ammunition and the powder was very scarce. And that's when he gave his famous order. Not unique in the annals of history, but certainly exemplified that day and made more famous sense. Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes. These men knew what they were doing because they were well trained with this. We talk about defending ourselves today, but how many people are really well trained with their firearms? They were. What I want to do is talk about another man that was there that day. A young man, suddenly thrust into the leadership of running the American Revolution for that time. When the Massachusetts Patriots that we're aware of, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, John Adams, Robert Treat Paine, had to go down to Philadelphia, they left a large vacuum in the leadership of Massachusetts, and that vacuum was filled by several men, one of whom was a man named Joseph Warren, who, along with one of his closest friends, Paul Revere, helped set up and organize the fight at Lexington and Concord. Joseph Warren was named the president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. He was also the one man responsible for keeping that army in the field from April 19th to June 17th. Not just provisioning them, but getting help from other colonies, from Georgia all the way up to the northern parts of Massachusetts, now known as Maine. The Provincial Congress had decided to name him a militia major general. The appointment had not been finalized yet. The Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, just named in Philadelphia, was on his way to take command of the army. Unfortunately, the plans for the British to take Charlestown had already started, and they had to move quickly. On the morning of the 17th, Warren shows up at the redoubt. Prescott looks at him and says, "Well, I think I should give you command." He says, "No." He says, "You're better at command than I am. I'm here as a private volunteer." The president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress sat in that redoubt as a private volunteer. However, he had the heart, and he had the actions, and he had the spirit of an officer, because that's how he acted that day. Many of you are familiar with the story. British forces, now somewhat battle-hardened after April 19th, but not entirely, attacked that redoubt in 3 waves. The first 2 were beaten back horribly. The third wave, which was actually a brave charge on the part of the British and their officers, quite remarkable, because they should not have been able to even mount it, but they did, swarmed against the redoubt. At that point, it was hard to get more ammunition. Those men literally were running out of cartridges. They had to fight hand-to-hand for that redoubt. 2 of the last men to leave that redoubt when they had their sabers parrying the British bayonets and the officers' sabers were William Prescott and Joseph Warren. William Prescott made it out of the redoubt unscathed by some miracle. Joseph Warren did not. Later on, it was discovered he was shot in the back of the head trying to help lead the retreat. Nobody knew for sure when he fell, but we knew it was after the end of the battle, when people were leaving the redoubt. He was still in it. And his body had been hastily buried by the British forces after desecrating it. And he discovered it months later after the British were forced to evacuate Boston. What I want to do is just take a few moments and go through some of the words from Joseph Warren on an oration he had given on March 6th, another anniversary date. It was the anniversary of the Boston Massacre. I want to read, it's a very long oration, I want to read 3 paragraphs to you, because I think the words that we have today, that we're going to hear, bear resonance to what we face today. That personal freedom is the natural right of every man, and that property or an exclusive right to dispose of what he has honestly acquired by his own labor necessarily arises, therefore, are truths which common sense has placed beyond the reach of contradiction. No man or body of men can, without being guilty of flagrant injustice, claim a right to dispose of the persons or acquisitions of any other man or body of men unless it can be proved that such a right has arisen from some compact between the parties in which it has been explicitly and freely granted. Just bear with me as I go for the other paragraphs. Our country is in danger. It is not to be despaired of. Our enemies are numerous and powerful, but we have many friends, determining to be free, and heaven and earth will aid the resolution. On you depend the fortunes of America. Having redeemed your country and secured the blessings to future generations, who, fired by your example, shall emulate your virtues and learn from you the heavenly art of making millions happy with heartfelt joy, which transports all your own. You cry, the glorious work is done. Then drops the mantle to some young Elisha, and take your seats with your kindred spirits in your native skies. Those words from Joseph Warren, spoken then, speak to us today. Spoken from beyond, spoken from a man who did give his life, and who was one of the biggest losses we suffered during that war. But he swore that it would be better to die in his knees, up to his blood and knees, than to live and to have his family and his fellow countrymen continue to live on the path they were heading. See, he died, he was killed, but he won. They all won. And my friends, we are going to win too. But it is now time to take the fight forward. So thank you very much, Dave. Happy Flag Day, and God bless you.